Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to the webinar today with Dr. Beth Allison Barr. From wherever you are, wherever you're joining us, we're so glad that you're here. I'm Reverend Elaine May. I'm the Women's Leadership Developer for the CRCNA. Women's Leadership is a ministry that supports women at all levels of leadership and helps churches and ministries create a culture for men and women to thrive in ministry. And I'm here with Amanda Benkausen. Amanda, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Dr. Amanda Benkausen and the Director of Safe Church Ministry for the Christian Reformed Church, which is a ministry which equips churches to be communities where the value of every person is protected and where all people are free to worship and grow in faith, free from abuse. So this is the 6th webinar in our series on being a safe church. And in this series, we've had the opportunity to speak with a number of authors and scholars and ministry leaders who have helped us wonder together about how we can cultivate healthy and safe congregations characterized by tov, goodness, in the words of Scott McKnight and Laura Barringer. And one of the recurrent themes in this series has been the importance of creating safe spaces for all to be seen and heard, and the importance of exploring as congregations how the practices and systems and theological convictions and the culture of our congregations may be contributing to or detracting from the safe space in which the spiritual formation of all persons can, where they can grow in free from abuse. And so throughout this series, we've wondered how to better honor the image of God in people, how to practice restorative conversations that lead to healing and reconciliation, how to engage in ministry in ways that are sensitive to the needs of those who have experienced trauma, how ministry leaders can be involved in helping those who are in situations of domestic violence. And today, we want to wonder with our guest, Dr. Beth Allison Barr, about ideas and convictions about women and women's roles, where they come from, and the impact that these ideas have had for women on their discipleship, their flourishing, and their sense of value and safety in the church.
Well, I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Barr. Dr. Barr is an associate professor of history and the Associate Dean of Graduate School at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. She specializes in medieval history, women's history, and church history. Dr. Barr has written for Christianity Today, the Washington Post, Religion News Service, and is a regular contributor to The Anxious Bench, the popular pathos website on Christian history. She's also, she's the author of several books, but her most recent book is The Making of Biblical Womanhood, How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth. Dr. Barr grew up in the Southern Baptist Convention, married a man who went on to be the pastor of in a Southern Baptist church as she pursued her calling in academia. Welcome, Dr. Barr.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're so glad you're here. Amanda and I are going to get the conversation started, but we would welcome your participation. So feel free to post questions. Eric Cass and Chelsea Shavi will field those questions and we'll work them into the webinar the best we can. Amanda, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Yeah, so just to be clear, you can post those questions in the chat and they will come to Eric and Chelsea and they will pass those questions on to us. So we're looking forward to your participation in this. All right, well, let's get started. So Dr. Barr, you grew up and were nurtured in faith through the ministry of churches associated with the Southern Baptist Convention. And there you learned certain ideas about what it means to be a faithful Christian woman, something you describe in the book as biblical womanhood. And throughout the book, you note a number of experiences that sort of gave you pause as you began to wonder where these ideas really come from. But a significant catalyst for your wondering was, and that contributed to your aha moments about this, was your study and your work as a historian and your study of Christian history. And so I thought, actually, that would be a really good place for us to start. So just take us on that journey a little bit, of discovering a history of faithful Christian women who didn't seem to quite fit in the boxes you had been taught about biblical womanhood. What did you learn about women's lives, experiences, and contributions in Christian history? And I just want to say, in your book, you note several times that there's a kind of amnesia about, or simply invisibility with respect to women in history, that they're not often included in Christian history texts. So one way to think of this question is, if you had the opportunity to write a church history survey text for seminarians and lay persons, what would you want your readers to know about women in Christian history?
That is a really good and a really big question.
Yeah.
So I'll start it off by just talking about what historians have known for a long time about how we record history. And that is that the way we tell the story is chosen by the person who writes the story. And so even though, and what's also very interesting is that if we look at the textbooks, like the primary history textbooks, and even the ones used in church history, and we look at their table of contents, and what we find is a striking amount of uniformity, that we're pretty much telling the same story that we've been telling really since the 19th century. And it was 19th century scholars who set the standard for how we tell the story of church history. And those 19th century scholars were living in the height of the Victorian age in England, as well as on the continent at the end of the Enlightenment era, which had decided that women's bodies and brains were made for domesticity, and that women were not intellectually as capable as men. And so the men who were writing, and they were men, the men who were writing these textbooks, or the story that became our textbooks, were mostly looking at church history from what we would call a political standpoint. So they were mostly looking at the leaders, what we would consider to be the bishops and the priests, and in really all men, almost completely men. It was also a very white history. It is a history that excluded global Christianity, and that when it did talk about global Christianity, it had a very paternal attitude towards it. That this is not, that the way that Christianity was done outside of the West is not the best way to do Christianity, that the best way to do Christianity is the way that white Europeans did Christianity. So we have to remember all of those things. I mean, so if we think about it, the way that our church history textbooks have been told in our seminaries is still based upon this 19th century standard that had a very white, imperial, and somewhat misogynist lens. And those are still the same stories that we are telling today. And so one of the things that I did in the Making of Biblical Womanhood, and it actually came from a larger study that I've been working on for a while. I have a spreadsheet where I go through church history textbooks, and I just go through and I just count how many women appear in those church history textbooks. And it is incredible how few women appear in church history textbooks, especially ones that are used in churches, like Christian history in plain English is one of the most popular ones, and Christian history made easy. And these have, I think one of them I counted something like 13 women that were included in it. Some of them I counted only like 7 or 8 women that were included in them, and they're pretty much the same women. Right. It's a very small number of women. And the way those women are couched, this is something too that is a striking similarity, is that the way those women are discussed is they are usually discussed in a way that is very distinctive from male leadership. And usually their gifts in teaching and preaching, and even, in leadership positions are recast to make it sound like they are doing what we would consider to be woman's work, that, they're in the background, that they're only teaching other women, or in the cases of women like Hildegard of Bingen and Hilda of Whitby, they might teach men, but it is very much put sort of in this background thing. Women like Hildegard of Bingen and Catherine of Siena are not described as preachers, even though medieval scholars would describe them as preachers. That's what they're doing. But in these popular church history textbooks, they're not described as preachers. They're described as, teachers and really monastics. That's how they emphasize it, that these are women who are monastics. So they're sort of in their proper place that's isolated from men. And therefore, it's okay for them to be serving God because they are still under masculine authority. So yes, the evangelical church has a significant amnesia about what women were really doing and the significant role that women have played throughout church history. We also have a significant amnesia in the perspective that we look at church history from. And I've been doing a little bit of work on, I promised folk that I'd write some on the ordination of women. This is a really fun topic. And one of the problems with the ordination of women is that when we talk about it from our perspective today, we want to look at it from how we define ordination. And we actually have a very narrow definition for ordination that doesn't apply to the past. And that's something that modern Christians don't understand either, or that we simply have forgotten. We don't teach this, is that ordination today did not look the same as it did in the medieval era. And really, this ordination was recognizing the gifts in the ministry to do liturgical duties. And the liturgical duties that are done today are not the same liturgical duties that were done in the past. And so I think our whole perspective, not only are we forgetting women, but when we look back and see women, we're looking at them through the lens of 20th and 21st century white male leadership, which means that we write things like women have never been priests, and women have never been, preachers in the way that men. And if you, in some sense, it's like, well, I guess if you're defining it in this very small box, I guess that's accurate. But the problem is that we made that box, and that box was drawn in really the 20th century, and it is not the box that was used throughout most of church history.
Right.
So if I was writing a church history textbook, I would want to reframe our box, where instead of looking at it from the way we look at it today, let's look at it from the perspective of the people who were living through it. And what we see when we do that, and in fact, I recently just wrote a blog post on this where I was refuting a pretty infamous review of my book on Bridget of Kildare. And one of the problems in Bridget of Kildare is an early medieval woman who actually was ordained as a bishop, but it's a really funny piece because she's accidentally ordained. The bishop who's ordaining her reads the wrong liturgy over her, and it says he's intoxicated with the Holy Spirit. So he's not, we don't know what that means. But nonetheless, he reads the wrong script over her, and she gets ordained a bishop. But in some ways, the way this story is told about her, it doesn't really matter if she is ordained or not, because she's doing the work of a bishop. And she's recognized by the people in her community as a spiritual and political leader, which is the way bishops would have been recognized. And so she's carrying all the authority of a bishop. She's doing lots of the same work of a bishop. Like there's all these funny stories. They're not meant to be funny, but they are funny, where she technically can't do the sacraments because she is a woman. So she brings with her a priest as her servant, and sort of, and he goes around with her and she tells him to do the stuff. I mean, it's like, she's the one who's calling the shots, but she's just having him do the things for her. So, I mean, it's really, when we look at it, and so we're like, are we going to draw her outside of ministry leaders because our box in the 21st century is too small to include her?
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the big, so I would reframe the box to not leave these women out and to understand the leadership that they played during their own during their own time.
Yeah, that's so helpful, Dr. Barr, just in terms of thinking about the categories that we have. We're looking for how persons in history reflected those categories. And it's such an interesting, maybe a backwards way of doing history, right? And then think about the fact that our histories don't include the stories of 50% of those who made up the church.
That's exactly right.
We should be asking some hard questions about that. Why are they not in our histories?
Right.
And what were they doing? What was their participation in the life of the church? And so I'm grateful for your work on that, and even just the conversation about reframing some of those categories.
Yeah.
Very helpful.
Dr. Barr, as you think about the attitudes towards women in church history, and, in particular, the medieval period that you're an expert in, and contrast that with the women in the Southern Baptist Convention today, what are some of the continuities or discontinuities in those attitudes? What were some of the things that you discovered? Or maybe put a different way, like we all have daughters. What would our daughters hear with regards to their value as women and the role that they have in the church if they were sitting in the pews listening to the medieval sermons that you have read and studied?
Yes, no, that's a very interesting question. So I'll start with the differences. And one of the major differences is that medieval women listening to sermons would have heard a lot more stories about women. They would have heard a lot more stories about female saints. They would have heard a lot more liturgy focused on women, such as the Woman of Kanan, which is one of the most prominent. This was a very common story. It was told at least once a year, although it came up more often than that in the liturgical calendar. It's a story that the way it was told in the medieval world, it's told from the perspective of this woman who Jesus, despite all of the men around him telling him not to listen to her, that Jesus listens to her. And that in fact, when this woman argues with Jesus, Jesus acquiesces to this woman. And so it's told from the perspective of a woman who, essentially wins an argument with Jesus. And it's one of the most interesting things that happens with this story is that when we find in many medieval sermons, they actually spiritualize this woman, and she becomes not just a woman in the first century who wins an argument with Jesus, but she's used to represent the ideal Christian. And so we see a woman who is not, who's breaking the rules of her first century society, and she is used to represent the best that a Christian can be. She does everything right, according to, these medieval sermons. So that's a powerful message that we know women were hearing. And I think that I haven't gone through and counted. I've listened to sermons since I was a child, and I have read a lot of modern sermons, a lot more actually than I really want to read, mostly because I've been doing this. And one of the things, I think there was just a huge gap between how many women were included in the medieval liturgy and how many women are included in modern sermons today. And I actually think that this is one of the reasons, I'm still Baptist, and there are a lot of Baptists converting to Catholicism or to Anglicanism. And this is pretty common among Protestant, right now, especially low church Protestants converting to high church. And I think one of the reasons for this is because of the liturgy, because Baptists, they hear a very standard type of sermon, the way that it's taught to be delivered, which is pretty common. But nonetheless, the way that this sermon ignores we leave out significant portions of Scripture. including stories about women. And I think that a lot of people who convert to Anglicanism and even to Catholicism, this is one of the things that they say that was missing in their church experience, was this deep liturgy that connected them back through the medieval era all the way back to the early church. And so they feel this longing to be connected to the medieval and the early church in a way that low churches, modern, like Baptist churches today, really don't do. And so for women, I can't help but think part of this may be that they hear more of themselves in those sermons. So that's the good part. That's a difference that I think is a good difference. But at the same time, medieval women would have also heard from the medieval church that they were less than men. The medieval world was not a golden age for women. The medieval church was not a golden age for women. This is something that I tried really hard to get across. Sometimes I feel like I fell because I see tweets that are like, oh, the medieval women could do all these things. And I'm like, it's not what I said. Like it's different. Patriarchy.
We can't romanticize it.
Yeah. I'm like, patriarchy is still there. It's just different. And in the medieval world, the difference, women were not considered spiritually equal with men. Their bodies were corrupt. Their bodies were more corrupt than men. Women were more likely to be sinful. Women were more likely to be sexually sinful. And women were further from God because of their bodies. And so, which, today, what we teach now is that women are spiritually equal to men. There's nothing wrong with our bodies, but they are designed to be different and under male authority. So we still teach that women are less than men. We just teach it in a different way. But women would have heard that in the medieval world. And in fact, they would have heard from preachers preaching those stories about women. They would have heard comments, like one comment in a sermon that one of my graduate students is working on, and it tells a story of a powerful female saint. And then at the end of it, the pastor stops and says, but women today don't do these things. It's sort of like, yes, in the past, women did this, but that was a time, we don't do that now. Sort of like warning women that this is not how they are supposed to behave. And then we also get one of the sermons that I've quoted a lot. It says that women and God be men. That the way for women to gain spiritual authority is to give up their femaleness, to give up, to not get married, to not have children, to be, separate from what ordinary women do. And by doing that, those women then can move closer to God like men and be able to exercise some of the spiritual authority of men. So I think it would have been a mixed message, sort of like it is today.
That's such an interesting comment, Beth. In my own studies, at one point early in his life, Augustine says something like, women image God only insofar as they are similar to men, like in what they share with men.
Yes.
There's that sense of men are somehow closer to God than women are.
Yeah. I mean, it's rooted in this Greco-Roman belief that women's bodies are corrupt, that they are not, and we think about this too, from a Western perspective, and that's a Western attitude. And we try to apply that attitude outward to the global church. And it's not something that the global church has always believed that. I mean, we can think, I have a graduate student working on medieval Ethiopia, and it's fantastic, the difference in how women are portrayed in some of those. I mean, there's still, as I said, patriarchy is still there, but it's different because it's culturally constructed.
So that's a really great segue into one of the questions from our listeners.
Yeah.
Do we have an example of church histories written by those from the Far East or from other parts of the world?
Yes, there are.
And
in fact,
how are they different?
Yeah, no, I can definitely put, we have a lot of work has been done on the global church and world Christianity. There is a great whole Cambridge series that is probably expensive, but it's accessible through libraries that you can find, that does a really good job in moving beyond the Western lens and moving outwards to the rest of the world. I'm trying to remember the author's name. I actually just ordered it. There's a book on medieval Christianity, medieval Christianity in Ethiopia, which I'm really excited. I've been doing a lot because I have the student who's working on medieval Ethiopia. And so there is a large amount of scholarship that is being done on the global church and the church beyond the Western lens. And what it is showing us is that we do have a lot of these ideas that we have about biblical womanhood, especially this idea that women are limited to, or women should focus on domesticity, that's our primary job. Being a wife and a mother is our primary job. That doesn't apply outward in the way that we think it does. This nuclear family in which all of the domestic work is put on the burden of the woman and all of the breadwinning is put on the burden of the man. This is a very Western perspective. It is also a very class-based perspective because most women throughout history and most women outside of the West, and especially in less wealthy families, you can't afford to have stay-at-home moms. And in fact, women in many places, like we think about it, like in Africa, women are just as critical to the home economy as men are. And I often think about one of my favorite non-Western saints is a woman named Walada Petros. And she is, I always think, we think about disrupting our understanding of biblical womanhood, Walada Petros, and you can get her. Wendy Belker is a great scholar, and she has a book on Walada Petros that you can get, as well as lots of other research that she's done on her. But Walada Petros is a 17th century Ethiopian woman. And she, some of the things that is very startling to our Western ears is that she was married, but she prayed that her children would die when they were born because they kept her from serving God. And she also, and we're like, oh my gosh, what? Now, yes, we're horrified, but it was it was her, it was sort of like she was forced to do this, but it kept her from doing what she wanted, that serving God. And so she was like, God, I need, this will enable me. And so that's what she prayed for. And she actually does. She becomes a very powerful a woman religious who exercises significant authority over men and does not look like a meek and mild and subservient white woman. And, when we're like, and if you think about it, you're like, but she is modeling her Christianity after the stories of these powerful female saints that she heard, that she, there's a book, a liturgical book called the Book of the Saints in Ethiopian Christianity. And one of my students, that's what she does. She works on the stories of those women and how they're different from the stories of Western saints in the medieval world. And one of the things that we find is different is that in the Western world, women's ability to be religious leaders often comes from their ability to give up their femaleness, to give up, they're virgins, or they forsake the family life after their husbands died, they're widows. In medieval Ethiopia, the religious authority actually stemmed to some extent. Now, Walada Petros is interesting, but it stems from their motherhood. And it stems, the power of their motherhood actually empowers their voice in a way that we don't see in white European Western Christianity. So I may have gotten off track a little bit.
Really interesting, really interesting. And we're going to segue as we begin to talk about the West here. So based on your discoveries in history, you make the argument that modern notions of biblical womanhood, particularly as you've seen them reflected in the Southern Baptist Convention and other conservative evangelical churches, it's a relatively new phenomenon, especially the way it's been formalized and codified as Christian truth.
Yes.
You note in the book that the term complementarianism is itself a relatively new term in Christian circles. So, we want to invite you to say a little bit more about that. Tell us a bit of your own journey as you've discovered that the Bible hasn't always been interpreted this way with respect to women's roles?
Yes, no, those are great questions. Complementarianism is a very recent word. 1986, 1987 is when that term was coined. It was coined by folk who thought patriarchy wasn't well received. And so they wanted a softer word for patriarchy. And so they revived, it's actually funny, they revived an Enlightenment term. Complementarity was used in the Enlightenment, but it was used in a very similar way, although not by Christians. It was used by secular Enlightenment philosophy, such as Rousseau, to emphasize that women are made for the private space. Their bodies are geared towards childbearing. So women, that's their job, whereas men are geared towards the public space. And so their bodies complement each other in the terms of, women are for home and household, men are for the public leadership. And so that's the way, but it was not a Christian term. It was not used to define, it wasn't created by Christian thinkers. And so it's really interesting. And sometimes I wonder if they know that. I wonder if they know that this term complementarianism has been used in the past, but not by Christians. But yet the way it describes what women and men should do is really similar. Because it describes now, complementarianism argues that women, that God designed our bodies, God designed who we are, for women to embrace, this emphasis on home and family, and whereas men should embrace their leadership roles. And so it's very new, and it was born in fear of what was going on in the 60s and the 70s. It was born in fear of the Equal Rights Amendment. I mean, you just cannot separate these things. The Equal Rights Amendment, of course, is defeated, but still there's a lot of push to give women legal status with men. I mean, I always tell my students that in the 70s and even into the 80s, that single women could not purchase cars without getting co-signed by their fathers or brothers or something like this. And I mean, this was law. And so those are the types of things that women were fighting against. And then we have here this Christian organization that steps in and says, not only are women not only are women made different than men and should, have different roles, but God ordained it. And this is really where the subtitle of my book came in. How the subjugation of women became gospel truth, because this is what we see happen in the late 20th century, is that not only is there people arguing that women should be subordinate to men, and that those texts of terror that we find, I'm quoting Phyllis Tribble there, those texts of terror that we find in the Pauline letters, that not only is that what women are supposed to do, but if you believe differently, then you are leaving Orthodox faith. You're leaving Orthodox faith. And this is one of the things that I think I'm really befuddling some of the folk who are responding poorly to my work, because they keep trying to throw me outside of the Orthodox faith, and they just can't, because I'm not. I'm a very solid Baptist. And I think this just befuddles them, because they're like, but I'm a faithful Christian, similar to what, to their idea of faithful Christian. And yet I reject female subordination because it's not part of the gospel. So I think that's part. What was the other part of your question, Elaine? Was it about how I came to this, or?
Yeah, just a little bit of the aha moments you had in your journey, right? So you're hearing this at church, right? Mm-hmm. You're experiencing it because you can't teach teenage boys the Bible, right? Or in youth group. Yeah. And yet in your academic work, you're fully using your teaching gifts. So Yeah, share with us a little bit
Yes,
about the journey and, the dissonance you're experiencing.
So it really did begin when I was in graduate school and when my husband started at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. We just had no idea what we were walking into. And we had no idea that Paige Patterson was moving into the height of his power at that time. And he was president of Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary when my husband started. And then, of course, I started a medieval women's studies program at Chapel Hill. I mean, very, very different worlds. But we also, the newspapers were inundated with the stuff that's going on with the SBC. This is when the SBC is beginning to rewrite the Baptist faith and message. They're beginning to, argue that women have to graciously submit to their husbands. This is what happens in the Baptist Faith and Message 2000. And then we also see it begin to write out that women cannot be senior pastors. And I remember that very vividly because it made me laugh, because I'm like, there are no senior pastors in the Bible. There's no senior pastors in the medieval church. There are there might be roles that we can equate to that we might say are the same, but they're not. Mm-hmm. It's a very different role. It's a very different construct that really is it's post 17th century. And really, it's not until the 19th centuries that we start seeing the evolution of the role of pastor and the way that we interpret it today. And so it just really struck me as this historical dissonance between what the church was in the past, and now we're drawing into this faith message. And also as a Baptist, this really struck me because, Baptists aren't creedal.
Right.
We're not. I mean, that's
the only creed is scripture.
Yes. And we can interpret that scripture, religious freedom of interpretation. And even though while there's general sort of guidelines of kind of like, this was what it means to be a Baptist, Baptists didn't throw each other out of their conventions. They didn't say, you're not Baptist anymore because, this is all new stuff that has kind of been written in, this idea that we are now creedal. And we are now defining orthodoxy, and not just orthodoxy for Baptists, but orthodoxy for the entire Christian church. And when you think about that's what the Nashville Statement was trying to do. Yeah. It was trying to do something like the Council of Nicaea. And it just really struck me. That was also a day I had a great deal of cognitive dissonance over was going, because, it didn't even matter what was in the Nashville Statement, just the audacity of what they were doing was just amazing.
Yeah.
So anyway, so
that's good. That's really helpful to place your experience in this, right? Like this redefining that's happening, that's coinciding your education even, right?
Yes,
so Amanda, you want to take it into the safe church world from here?
Yeah.
Let's shift.
I just
go ahead.
Comment on what you were just talking about, Beth. So that isn't part of our tradition in the CRC.
Right.
There's such a wide diversity of beliefs about the roles of men and women and what the Bible says about men and women in the CRC, and some sort of map on closer to what you would describe as complementarianism, but this idea of embedding it into statements of faith.
Right.
The way we have seen in the Baptist Convention, so that it becomes considered a point of orthodoxy that you hold to the subordination of women. That isn't something that has been true of our own history, and so I think it's just helpful just to name that in this conversation. What you're reacting to is this idea that it's now being held up, and history is in some ways being rewritten in light of this.
Yes, or at least only one perspective from history is being used to support this.
Yeah.
So, and I think too that's, throughout history, we have seen wide-ranging opinions on what women are able to do in the church. But it is, and while there was some, we think about the Catholic Church, and of course there is orthodoxy there, but there was always room put in for women. And what really strikes me about this modern conservative evangelical, in these very low church sort of like Baptist, the Baptist world, Church of Christ world, et cetera, is this explicitly tying it to orthodoxy. And so that is, as you point out, that is something distinctive from what other traditions who have disagreement on this issue, but they're not tying it to orthodoxy.
Right.
So.
Right. Exactly. Well, I would like to shift the conversation because I am the director of Safe Church Ministry, and there are a couple of questions even in the chat about, well, what does this have to do with Safe Church? So, but I'm interested in the ways, and I mentioned this at the beginning, the ways the culture of our churches include systems and theologies and the narratives we tell ourselves contribute to an environment where abuse can flourish. And I'm mindful that Rachel Den Hollander, for instance, has noted that the emphasis sometimes on forgiveness in our churches without also calling for justice leads to a situation where victims bear the burden of the wrongdoing while an offender is released from any accountability or consequences for their actions. And that the result is that abuse gets minimized and dismissed, and victims are often re-traumatized. And so this really beautiful theology of forgiveness can be used in ways that actually make our churches less safe and mean that the church responds to abuse in ways that are not always helpful. And so one of the things I want us to talk about is the connection between these theologies about male headship and female subordination and abuse. And I just want to, throw out there this caveat that we all know that not all people who hold to complementarianism are abusers, and not all people who hold to a more egalitarian view, and I put that in quotes because none of these terms are scriptural.
Right, I know. I'm with you. I resist all these terms.
I know. That not all egalitarians, they treat women respectfully. So abuse doesn't sort of map on to those theologies exactly, but you note a connection and others have noted a connection. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yes, no, this has been one of the most difficult parts to kind of tease out. And one of the reasons in a lot of these more conservative spaces, what we find, and this, I think the Church 2 movement really shows what happened here, is that women who are in these spaces who find themselves in abusive situations, they have no channel to get out. They have because their leadership is not recognized, because their husband's authority is recognized as godly and over them. The burden of proof is placed solely on the woman. She is the one who is often, it's instead of the abuser being proved, guilt, being the one who has to prove his innocence, it's the woman who has to prove that these things really are happening to her, or even that this is really abuse. This is some of and you can think about this. So it's not that abuse, that complementarianism leads to abuse. There's not a direct line, but what there is that complementarianism leads to systems that make it much less likely for women to be able to report abuse and to get out of abusive situations. And it also leads to situations in which men who are abusers are more likely to get away with it. And so I think that correlation is pretty clear. And so, people behave badly in all sorts of different arenas, but there are some arenas where it's more likely for them to get away with it. And complementarianism, because of its lack of emphasis on the female voice, because of its lack of emphasis on women in leadership positions who are more likely to understand especially in these more conservative spaces, are more likely to understand what is going on in the household with these women. That there is, that there is no clear way for these women to get out of these abusive situations, or even to keep them from continuing to happen. I mean, one of the stories that just, every time I think about it, it almost makes me cry, is in the Houston Chronicle had this whole series on sexual abuse, more than 700 pastors who had been accused or convicted of sexual crimes of some degree. And there's this story that this mom told about her daughter who, I see a picture of it, and it just makes me think of my daughter. I have an 11-year-old daughter. And this woman's daughter was like 13 or 14. And she was sexually abused by a pastor in the choir room. And the mom, tells this story. She says, I never got her back after that. That this, because the girl was too afraid to tell. I mean, there's no clear way. I mean, how do you report a pastor abusing you when they're the ones who are in leadership position over you and your family? How do you report that a man who you are not married to, and who is married to somebody else, and yet has had a sexual encounter with you when you are living in purity culture, which says that if you are not a virgin in almost every sense of the word before you get married, that you have messed up in a way that can never be redeemed. And that the only thing that you can be is, you're a soiled, I remember this, you're a soiled piece of linen. And even though you can iron it out, this is an example I remember, it's still soiled. And you think about women who hear those messages and then are in churches where there is no path for them to be able to tell that. And then when they do tell it, it's going to automatically condemn them because of this purity culture. There's no way out
Right.
for them. And, the mental distress, the emotional distress that this inflicts upon women, especially young women who are still not confident in who they are, who are still learning about who God is. And this becomes the defining moment of their lives. And, what happened to this young girl who was molested in the choir room is she ended up getting, I think she became addicted to opiates. I'm sure this is also part of the opioid, and she eventually committed suicide. And, it's just this horrible story. And that mom, I mean, I just think about it, her just saying, I never got her back. And I think that's what is happening in churches that are teaching these theologies, that women are less than men, and that women's worth is tied to their sexuality with, their potential husbands. And that if any of that gets messed up along the way, that they are no longer as valued in the eyes of God or in the eyes of their church. Right. And, just the emotional havoc that wreaks on women is immeasurable. It is also something I'm firmly convinced of this because, I think about it. I mean, I'm one of these victims. I've talked a little bit about my story. I've told about as much as I want to tell. I have a lot of witnesses for my story, but one of the things I think about is I never reported it. And so, people say, well, there's not a direct correlation. We can't count. There's not complementarian churches. There's not as many there's not more reported cases of sexual abuse than outside. And I'm like, well, I'm a woman who didn't report it. And there's a lot of women who didn't report it. Right. And so I also think about that, I'm like, what if we all reported it? Is that going to change? Is that going to change the way? Because, as I said, it's not that there are most men are not abusers, but men who are abusers, there are less checks and balances on them. and less ways that women who are abused can report it, or even young boys who can report it. I mean, we just all are still reeling from the information about Paul Pressler that came. I mean, we knew it, but when you actually read it, like laying out and just the hypocrisy and how people enabled him to get away with this for years, decades.
Right.
And
yeah,
then,
Beth Moore says something like complementarianism can become such a high core value that it inadvertently becomes elevated above the safety and well-being of women.
Yes, that's
And
exactly right.
I thought that was a really, that was sort of on point in terms of describing what is the issue. It's that the theology takes precedence over the safety and well-being of women.
Right. That's exactly right. And so I think that, and in fact, one of the stories that I use in my book that directly relates to this is a story of a medieval woman, Christine de Pizan, who wrote, in the book, she got involved in a letter writing campaign advocating for women. And I mean, it's really fascinating what she does. But one of the things that she writes is she writes about the problem of I always kind of compare it to like 50 Shades of Grey, these trashy romance novels that devalue women. And one of those was going around that was, during the, and everybody was like reading it, kind of like with 50 Shades of Grey, everybody was reading it. And Christine de Pizan began a letter writing campaign against it. And one of the stories that she tells is this woman whose husband would read that book and then would go home and say, this is all, that this is what women are, that women are always going to lie and are always, they're always deceitful and they're always going to sleep with other men. And so then he would beat his wife because of this. And Christine Pizan, she said, she essentially said that, these ideas matter, that when we tell stories about women and say that they are more deceitful and that they're not worth as much as men, then men treat them that way. And so she wrote the book of the City of Ladies, in which it was countering all of those ideas by saying women have always been worth just as much as men in God's eyes, and women have always contributed just as much as men in society. And we've got to, if we want to change the way women are treated, we have to change the way we think about women. And that directly connects to our theology. What we teach about women matters. So
she's one of my favorite women in history as well.
Yeah.
I do some writing on her, and I think what a brave and courageous woman. I mean, she was writing to provide for her family. Her husband had passed away, and
she was very young too.
Very young. She's in this environment where there's not a lot of options for women, and she starts taking up her pen and writing as a court writer first, but then sort of feels compelled to defend her sisters.
It's fascinating. And I mean, and this is all of her works make this connection. I mean, what she is doing is changing ideas about women so women will be treated better.
And just to point out, this is like 14th, early 15th century that she's doing this,
that's exactly
which is just phenomenal to me. And she's appealing to scripture to do it. She's showing in scripture how God values women. God created women to be people of worth, and she's beautiful.
Well, and she also appeals to stories about women that both women and men would have known from going to church.
Right.
And those are stories that we don't have today. We ignore. It goes back to the beginning of our conversation.
Right. Well, we're quickly running out of time. So I want to get in, there's a couple of questions that came through the chat that I want to make sure we get to. One is, are there any resources that you would recommend to parents who are seeking to broaden the perspectives and experiences of their children with reference to the role of women in the church through global history?
Oh, yes. Yes, there are. I'm trying to think what the sources that immediately come to mind, of course, are sources that I teach from. And that's one of the things that really does need to be remedied, because we just don't have as many stories. There is a recent, very accessible book that also brings in women of color, and it's called Brown Girls of the Bible. And it's sort of done like a devotional that pulls on these stories of women. And so I think that would be a really good resource. I also think that any sort of, you can kind of look, any sort of like liturgical devotional that walks through the liturgical year is going to hit a lot more passages about women than what many ordinary women hear in Protestant sermons. And so that's something too. Just even bringing out the highlighting of these women. And the other thing is just talk to your kids. Challenge their narratives. Like, I remember one time when my daughter came home and she had history fair, and she was like, "Oh, I hope I get to be a woman in history." And I was like, "Why? Why would you not get to be a woman in history?" And she said, "Well, there's not enough women on the list. There's not enough women." And I was like, so we made out a new list.
That's
and
great.
Suggested some changes. And, and even then, like my daughter, she came home just last week, and she had a list of, these scientists that they're supposed to talk about. And she said, "Mom, did you know there's only 3 women on this list?" And she says, "I bet we can find more women who were important in science." And I was like, "Yeah, I bet we can." And so, it's just, if you just train them to kind of think that what they are hearing is only some of the story, it's amazing how quickly they realize on their own, and they start looking for other things themselves. So I just even think that, like, even more than just resources, just talk with your children, talk with them when the sermons they hear, like when they only hear stories about the disciples, go and read stories about Mary and Martha and these women, go read Romans 16, go read the stories of women that don't counter, but complement in the biblical way these stories of men.
Yeah. Read Luke 8.
Yes.
These women that financially supported the ministry, right?
Yes.
I'm like, wait a minute, you can't read past that verse.
No, that's so funny. Yeah. Women supported, women financially bankrolled
supported.
Jesus.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, so I have 3 daughters, 4 kids, 3 daughters. Amanda has 2 daughters. One of my daughters was Amelia Earhart at that, history fair. So we have them here too.
Yep.
I was finishing seminary when one of my daughters was in middle school, and she and her friends started calling me MP. And I was like, "What's MP?" She's like, "Mom, a preacher." It just makes you aware that even by not saying anything, right, how we conduct ourselves,
yes,
and the pursuits that we engage send a message. So, like, as we're wrapping up, we've got just a few more moments. But you have a daughter, we have daughters. What is your hope for our daughters and what they hear about their value and their place in the church, in congregations today?
That is really, really my hope. That is really a lot of what lay behind me writing this book. Being in youth ministry for so long and seeing all of those young women coming through, and at times just breaking my heart because I wanted to tell them that the church limits women in a way that God never has. Mm-hmm. And that's what I want. My goal is not to make all women be working moms, or to make all women want to be in ministry, or to make all, it's not that. My goal is for women to know that God has always valued women just the same as men. Just go read how Jesus listens to women in an age where he doesn't have to. Yeah. And he does. And he values their words. He values their speech. And he always, whenever he says you are of great faith, he says it to a woman. And so, just letting women know that, and letting women know that they can be whatever God calls them to be. And that's really what I want them to hear. I don't want to make them a certain way. I want to let them be what God has called them to be, and to know, and to not worry about fitting a certain mold that is culturally created.
Thanks for that, Dr. Barr.
Yeah.
Leanna Starr, an early 20th century female scholar, she wrote, she was writing on Genesis 1:27, where it says, and 28, where it says, 28, where it says, God says to Adam, like the Adam that he created, so like the male and female, says to them, be fruitful and multiply and rule over the earth and subdue it. And in response, Leanna Starr says, so basically, God has given both male and female this commission to rule over the earth together.
Yes.
So women would literally have to step off the face of the earth to transgress their divinely given role.
Yep.
And I think that's just such an interesting way to think about it. She starts at Genesis 1, and she says, if we start at Genesis 1, we have a totally different understanding of the roles of men and women.
Yes, that's exactly right. Perspective matters.
Yes.
So.
Well, it has been just a delight and a joy to have you with us today, Dr. Barr. We're so grateful for your work in this area. We're so grateful that you could join us today. I also want to thank Reverend Elaine May, who had to slip out because she has another meeting, and a special thanks to Reverend Eric Cass and Miss Chelsea Shavy, who worked in the background to make all of this happen and go smoothly. So I'm grateful for all of them. And thank you to all of you who are joining us today. It's been a wonderful conversation to have. We're thrilled to be able to offer this webinar. And at Safe Church, we offer our webinars free of charge. And because it's free, you are under no obligation to give. But if you have found our webinars an effective way of generating awareness about issues related to abuse, or for providing training for ideas for abuse prevention in the church, we would, and this is an issue that matters deeply to you, we would welcome your financial contribution. So even with a small donation, you can help us continue to offer great webinars like this one. That will help make the church a safer place for everyone. And you can do that by going to www.crcna.org/safechurch. And you should see the button on the website that will allow you to donate there. If you can't remember that, just email us at safechurchministry@crcna.org. We'd love to connect with you. All right, well, thanks everyone. It's been wonderful to have this time together.
Thank you.
Wonderful afternoon. Take care.